All right, so we stopped with verse 15, or we didn't actually get to verse 15 yet. We finished on thou shalt not commit adultery. So Reggie said something in his prayer that is, well, it's significant. He said about, in Bible class, may we learn something that will help make our lives easier. And that's what God's Word is about. Life is hard enough as it is. But then to live in contradiction to what God has revealed, that's just going to make it harder. And we know by experience that living the Christian life doesn't mean that all your problems go away and your health's going to magically reemerge and be everything you want it to be, and you're never going to have any financial problems. That's not promised anywhere in Scripture, and life is difficult. But it's a whole lot more difficult if you run against God's will. It's like God told Cain all the way back in Genesis 4, if you do well, you will be accepted. And if not, then sin lies at the door and its desire is for you. We can make life a whole lot harder than it has to be if we live in direct contradiction to God's Word. So that when he said that, I got to thinking about that. So don't steal anything, verse 15. That'll just make your life harder. Stealing, so who wants to read for me real quick? All right, John, Proverbs 30. Nope, where am I? Proverbs 6, verse 30. And who else raised their hand? Tristan, get the Ephesians 4:28. I put this in your outline. Stealing, while sometimes tolerated out of a pseudo-compassion. In other words, well, the state of California has some interesting laws on stealing, don't they? What is it? If it's anything under like $900, I guess it's not considered a criminal act, something like that. That's pseudo-compassion. People need things. Did you guys know about that law? That's the place to be. That doesn't matter. The big industry is the enemy, Jeff, right? Yeah, we're not far from that here. All right. So out of a pseudo-compassion, people will tolerate bad behavior. We see that on the left politically all the time. All right, Proverbs 6:30. John. I don't know why I looked at Tristan.
People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is starving.
All right, there might be some scenarios, John, where you tolerate somebody stealing. The guy is starving to death. He just took a can of soup from you. And you might tolerate that, but stealing is stealing, right? Okay, who's got the next verse? Tristan. Ephesians 4:28.
Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth.
Okay, so it was wrong to steal, just like every other commandment. Going back up to verse 12. Man-to-man relationship, it's always been wrong to steal. It'll never be right to steal. And although some may tolerate stealing, the theft is still a theft, right? So, don't do that. Verse 16. Turn the page here. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Who wants to read for me? Tristan, are you still in Ephesians 4? All right. I'll let you get verse 25. So this is the forbidding of false and damaging testimony about others. Ephesians 4:25. You said you can be. Are you going to do that tonight? Or okay, go ahead. Yes.
Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another.
Okay. Well, there you go. Thankfully, we have a billboard in our community that tells us that. Number 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, wife, servants, animals, anything that is your neighbor's. To covet. Oh, here's your next blank. The other commands prohibit specific actions, while this prohibits an attitude, if you've got your outline from last week. This one prohibits an attitude, because what might covetousness lead to? If you have, looking at the definition, if you have an inordinate, unregulated desire for John's can of soup, you're coveting that, what might that lead you to do? Steal it. It might lead you to, if he tries to defend his property, murder. Right? You might take his life to steal something from his. So covetousness is a mentality. What is it? Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. Avoid covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. That verse tells us. All right, any thoughts on those last 3 of the 10 commandments? Again, these are eternal principles. These didn't just evolve out of nowhere when Moses went up the mountain to get the tablets of stone. Exodus 20, verses 18 to 21, not a lot of comment here. This is the people's reaction. They've witnessed the thunderings, the lightnings, the sound of the trumpets. The mountain is, why is the mountain smoking or covered in smoke? What does that represent? God's presence. Moses has gone up there in the midst of that, and the people are terrified. And it's like, so the prohibition was, the people don't even touch the mountain. Well, I don't think they had to worry about that. They didn't want to get near it because of all of the sound and sights and sounds of what's going on. But then, what does Moses tell the people in verse 20? 2 words. Fear not. That sight should produce a mentality of reverence, great respect. I mean, we're in the presence of God, but don't be afraid of God. Fear not, for God has come to prove you, and that His fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. You need to hold God in such a high regard that you don't want to commit sin. You don't want to violate His commandments. Number one, because He's God, and, well, looking at the sights and sound and hearing the sounds, imagine what He could do to you. But then He's providing this for you. He's brought you out of Egypt. He's fed you. He's watered you. It's not just a phobia, a terror, being frightened by God. It's reverence for who He is and what He's done. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near. All right, any questions or comments? All right, verses 22 to 26. This is an interesting little text here. Again, no graven images, silver, gold, nothing like that. And when you make me an altar, what was this altar to look like? What was it to be made of? Rocks, dirt, and how was it to be formed? How was it not to be formed? Let me ask it that way. You don't fashion it in any way. You just get some rocks and whatever will hold those rocks together, and you build me an altar. And I was reading that, just rereading it, and got to thinking about that. And this is in regard to the worship of God. There's nothing spectacular about this. And you look at the structures that have been built throughout history to God, and He just says, throw some rocks and dirt together, and that'll be your altar. That'll be where you sacrifice to me. A marker? Yeah. We can get hung up on the externals, can't we? The physical structures. And God is, I don't need all that. It's very simplistic. So they'd be traveling to the promised land, and an altar made from earth makes sense. They're traveling. They're not going to stay one place very long. Whenever the pillar of fire or the pillar of cloud moves, they move. That's why they built the tabernacle. They could tear it down, put it back up, as the people move. So finally here, your last 2 points, blanks. God would reveal His approval regarding the location and elements of worship. Location and elements. Again, last 2 blanks from last week's outline. Our worship to God is not dictated by us. But the major thrust of modern day Christendom, of the Christian world in terms of worship, fog machines, light shows. I saw a preacher zip line in from the back of the auditorium to the stage like he was the returning Christ. And it's all worship has become a production in many ways for a lot of people. And that's the, for instance, when we talk about choirs and instrumental music. Well, these people just have a talent for that kind of stuff. We need to, we need to use our God-given talents. And, well, that's like show and tell in the 2nd grade. Do they still do that in school, show and tell? Yeah. When I was a kid, that was the thing, man. Bring a toy to school and show it and tell everybody about it. That's what worship has become for a lot of folks. Look how talented I am. And God says here to the Israelites, when you build an altar, I want rocks that you haven't messed with, and whatever will hold those rocks together. Yes?
That goes all the way back to Cain and Abel.
Yep.
I mean, it's really not much different what was done there than what they're doing today. I mean, I want to do it my way because I feel like my way is better than the way God, the way He's wrote, commanded it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do it my way, and He'll just have to accept it.
Yep.
Didn't work out too good for you.
Didn't work out too well, did it? Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. When sin entered the world, it opened the floodgates. I mean, you've got Genesis 4 there, like you mentioned. You've got the worship. Cain's not done what pleases God. Just a little bit later in that chapter, Lamech has 2 wives, so you've got the introduction of polygamy. And it just goes downhill from there. The altar was to be simple and unadorned by man's imagination. I think that's the key. It's not about your imagination. That's why he said you don't build any image of anything in heaven above, on earth beneath, or in the waters that are under the earth. You don't try to fashion what I might look like to you and then worship that. It was not to be elevated because of immodesty. We'll get to that later in Exodus chapter 28 when the altar in front of the temple is built, because it has steps and the priests had specific garments they had to wear to cover their nakedness. I don't want to get into that tonight. Any questions or comments on chapter 20? That's an interesting discussion, and I don't know. Because the tabernacle, we're going to get into that. We're not going to hit every detail. We're going to kind of group that together, but the tabernacle was, I guess I would use the word elaborate, but it was done at the direction of God.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So He must have approved, but it was tremendous.
Yeah.
It covered with gold.
Yeah. The temple was magnificent. All right, Exodus chapter 21. The first 11 verses are about, the way I had titled this, indentured servitude. When you and I think of slavery, from our historical context, what do we think of? Anybody? Okay, we think of, well, for us, for our historical context in America, we think of Civil War, that kind of what's referred to as chattel slavery, plantations, things like that. And what we're getting ready to discuss is not anything like that. It's not even close. One thing that we need to understand as we get into this is that slavery has been common way before Israel here. And so what we have here is, and I'll deal with this in the first blank, is our not prohibitions to slavery, but regulations to govern it in such a way so as to eventually bring an end to slavery. And ultimately, that's what has happened. So, chapter 20, verse 1 through 23:33, that whole section, the Ten Commandments and then a variety of laws, which basically have to do with human rights, is referred to as the Book of the Covenant in chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. God tells Moses, I want you to write all of this down in a book. And so, that's not insignificant. Slavery, as Americans typically think of it, existed long before these laws were revealed to Israel. And here's your first blank. The laws revealed here actually repressed slavery, repressed it. It inhibited slavery. It put controls on how it was done and how the owners treated their servants. And ultimately, of course, it helped bring it to an end. There's a lot of additional information. I put Leviticus 25, 39 to 42, Deuteronomy 15, 12 to 15. There is a lot of information in the law of Moses in regard to slavery. But here, if you could boil it down to 3 points, how would you become a slave in this culture? Number one, because of poverty. I tell you what, who wants to read for me? Let's do this. All right, Leviticus, get that one for me, please. Leviticus 25, 39. Poverty. A father could sell his daughter into another home, but it was for the purpose of marriage. We'll get to that. That's right in our chapter here. But then also, you could become a slave because you stole somebody's property and you can't pay it back, so now you go to work for them to pay it back. All right, Leviticus 25, 39. He becomes poor and what? Sells himself to you? You don't compel him. So, we need... This is one of those passages that people have used to attack the Bible. See, the Bible condones slavery. The Bible encourages slavery. So, that's just something to think about. All right. Okay. Do you need one? Well, it's too late now. I already asked. Okay, Danny's getting it for you. Oh, never mind. Bryce has got it for you. Thank you. All right. So let's just start reading here. Exodus 21:1. Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. So there's one thing. You serve for a limited amount of time, and then you're set free. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him... Now this is interesting. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. But I love my master. Now, with our historical context of slavery, do you think that would be a response to those slave masters just, 150 years ago? I love my master and I want to stay here forever? No. And so that, again, helps us understand this is not what you and I typically imagine as slavery. Indentured servitude is where basically the one who goes to serve, like signs a contract, agrees to the terms, and fulfills his obligation. That's what we have here. It's not the typical thing that we think about. So, verse 4. His master has given unto him a wife, and they have children. Well, he's agreed to this term of service, and the master gave him this wife, and then they had children. Well, those are the master's, that's the master's property. He's purchased them. There's even a purchase price set. But if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out free. And here's a key too. Look at verse 6. Then his master shall bring him unto the judges. All of these things that we're going to be reading about in Exodus 21 had to be adjudicated. You had to have a hearing about everything that we talk about in this chapter. This wasn't just up to one person or another. This is why Israel has judges. When you open the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 1, specifically verses 16 through 18, there are the qualifications for these judges in Israel. All of this is being revealed at this point in real time, but more laws come into effect later. I don't know if that's the best way to say it, but that's the best way I can formulate it at the moment. The case has to be tried. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. We sing that song, don't we? Pierce my ear. That's what this is about. When you sign up, as it were, to become a servant of God, it's a lifetime commitment. And so this is a picture, that song is a picture of this type of thing here. But again, you see the relationship between slave and master. And the New Testament even addresses this language, or addresses this subject. Ephesians chapter 6 and Colossians chapter 4. And so, slavery is a reality. It's still a reality today. Slavery still happens in this world. Trafficking still happens in this world. And that actually comes up in this chapter too. What these laws do are basically deter criminal activity, deter injustices, while at the same time enforcing rather strict laws. That makes sense? Any questions or comments about any of that? All right, okay, so here's your next blank. Males were to be set free after 6 years of service. What's the 7th year? Year of Jubilee. He could be released sooner. That's the next point. He could be released sooner, according to Leviticus 25 and verse 40, if it were the year of Jubilee. He was to be treated properly. Somebody turn over to Leviticus 25 again. Who wants to get Deuteronomy for me? All right, Jeff, get Deuteronomy 15, verses 13 and 14. And who's getting to Leviticus 25? All right, Colin, get verses 40 and 43, please. And just tell us what you're reading and read it when you get there.
Leviticus 25, 40, and 43. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Verse 43, you shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God.
Do not rule over him with rigor. You don't treat them harshly. You don't mistreat them. All right? Who's next? Yep. Give him liberally. This is after that term of service is over. And that's why I think indentured servitude, you know what that means, is a better term than slavery because of our historical familiarity with that particular term. So he wouldn't leave empty-handed, but also he could choose to stay because of the good relationship between himself and the one to whom he sold himself. And again, that shows a major difference too. Verses 7 through 11 is about females. And provision was made for them. They were more, what's the word I'm looking for? They were more apt to be taken advantage of, let's say, than a man. She could be sold to a wealthier family for the purpose of marriage. If you notice in this text here, verse 7, she shall not go out as the men servants do. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, he's taken her to marry her. Well, she can be redeemed. She can be bought back by her family. And his master shall, no, wrong verse, verse 8. No, to sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power. Can't sell her to a foreigner, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. So he took her on terms that he was going to marry her and treat her as a wife, but he didn't. And so he can do that. Or if he has betrothed her unto his son, he got her to marry his son, then he needs to treat her like one of his own daughters. These are protections in civilization in that time for women. It's not what it's often painted to be by biblical skeptics. Here's another thing that's being regulated. If he take him another wife, does God approve of polygamy? No. But it happened in culture. And so you regulate it, and that's what's happening here. Nothing of hers, the one that was purchased, nothing of hers can be diminished. He's got to fulfill his duties to her. And if he do not these three things to her, from verse 10, then she shall go out free without money. She was taken for a specific purpose, and they've tricked her. Well, there were laws to, again, protect her after she leaves. Any questions or comments on that? You mean enforce it? The judges of Israel. That goes back to verse 6. Do what? Whoever was appointed as an elder or a judge in Israel would handle it. Do you remember when, what chapter is it? Exodus 17. When Moses' father-in-law Jethro saw Moses judging all of Israel, he said, that's too much for you. You need to appoint men who can handle small matters. Those guys. And there were their qualifications laid out, what kind of men they were to be. Let them handle the smaller cases. They'll bring the big stuff to Moses. So, that's why I said earlier, all these things in chapter 21 have to be adjudicated. There has to be a hearing. You don't just take it upon yourself to do this or do that. It's structured. Well, and that's Deuteronomy 1. They have to be faithful men who fear God and who won't take bribes. And they won't show favoritism to the poor. So they had to meet certain qualifications to serve as judges. Right. Yeah, again, it had to be tried. Because, well, you remember a few years ago in our own country, particularly with the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, believe all women. You remember that? The Me Too movement? And our country started going crazy in all that time. Every accusation that's ever brought has to be believed or you're a misogynist. Right? Well, that's not exactly just. So there were structures in place to regulate that kind of stuff. And I think too, because, so going back to the judges from Exodus chapter 17, it was taken, the spirit that was upon Moses was also given to them. I think that's like the spiritual gifts of the New Testament, the spirit of discernment. The Holy Spirit was with those men to guide them in those decisions. Anything else? Could very well be.
If you come out of that, you can't help but kind of maybe bring some of that with you. You know, they were 400 years in slavery. It'd be hard not to bring some of those habits.
Absolutely. That's a good point. And
We think that they, might have been why this was laid out like it was.
And what are we? We're just a few months out of that captivity. They've been there for 400 years. Yeah, that makes good sense, doesn't it? All right, capital punishment. Murder and manslaughter. Now, these are English terms. Murder is intentional, from what I understand. Manslaughter is you killed somebody, but it was like by accident. Does that sound right? I mean, there are a lot of nuances to that, obviously, but I did the best I could. I'm no lawyer. Murder and manslaughter. The cities of refuge, that's your next blank. The cities of refuge were later appointed for safety and judgment. Again, so he says here, what verses are we in? Verses 12 and 13. He that smiteth a man so that he die, he shall surely be put to death. If a man lie not in wait, in other words, it's not premeditated, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. And you, again, go read Joshua chapter 20. They had to go through a hearing, but they could flee to this. There are 6 cities appointed. They could go to one of these cities for safety until they could have a case, to hear the case. Premeditated murder, verse 14. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. That was like you could run to God's altar and plead for mercy. Well, it's too late. Premeditated murder, you're done. Assaulting one's parents was capital punishment. Kidnapping and trafficking. So I mentioned that earlier. Verse 16. He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. There is a lot of human trafficking in our world. Capital punishment. Stealing, kidnapping, and selling people. Insulting or wishing for the downfall of one's parents. Verse 17. He that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. That goes back to one of the 10 Commandments, doesn't it? Honor thy father and thy mother, that thou mayest live long on the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now there are more, later on, further on into the law of Moses, there are more things that fall under the heading of capital punishment, but there are 6 laws right there. Laws, okay, verses 8. Any questions or comments on that section? Verses 18 through 27, laws regarding various assault crimes. In an assault with no death, restitution for time lost was to be paid. If you injured somebody and they missed work, you have to restore what they lost. That's on you. Let's see, verse 20. If a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be punished. Literally, the Hebrew term there is avenged. And that's your next blank. Punish means avenged. It's the exacting of satisfaction. What's the penalty for taking a man's life? The death penalty. That's what that's referring to. You have a servant and you beat him to death, you die. Okay? That's pretty straightforward. And could they be forgiven before they get... You mean by God? I would think so. Because you're not going to catch them in the act, and probably. It'd probably take some time because, again, it has to go before the judges. You couldn't just... I'm sorry? No, we're not told exactly. Of course, later, particularly when you get into the book of Leviticus, you have all the sacrifices for... And here's one of the things maybe to consider with your question. Could they get forgiveness before they were put to death? Well, Leviticus talks specifically about both intentional and unintentional sins. And we're reading about intentional sins here. So sacrifices could be made to be forgiven, but you still have the punishment. I mean, that still happens today, doesn't it? A person commits a crime, you can be forgiven by God, you can be made right with God, but there still may be consequences that follow that action.
This is later, but Moses was guilty years before of murder. 40 or 50 years before this.
Yeah.
I guess he was forgiven, but it's not
Right. He was under Egyptian law anyway at that time.
He probably would have been put to death if he'd been caught.
Oh, well, that's why he ran to Midian. Yep.
It seems like their punishment would be a lot quicker than what we see today in our world, for sure. They're not going to sit in prison for.
Somebody, yes. Somebody look this up. I know it's in Ecclesiastes, and it says because something like because a crime is not. What? Yeah, I want to say it's in Ecclesiastes 9, maybe verse 11, but something like because a crime is not speedily executed, people are more apt to commit more crime. That's a paraphrase, so if you're Google searching that, I don't know where it'll take you. But if you can find it, somebody let me know. Okay. So this law, going back to if you have a slave and you beat them to death, you die. This law protected servants, but it also served as a deterrent to the masters. There is obviously some form of corporal punishment that could be enforced, not capital punishment, corporal punishment on servants. But this deterred them from, the masters from obviously taking it too far. Notwithstanding, verse 21, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished. He shall not be avenged. In other words, you don't put him to death. For he is his money. The master purchased that at his own cost, purchased that individual at his own cost. And obviously, if it takes some time to die, the implication is he didn't intend to kill him. How do you explain that? I don't know. But there are what we call sometimes safety rails to govern the behavior both of slave and master. Anybody find that Ecclesiastes verse yet? 8:11. Who's going to read it for me? I said 9:11. That's close. I butchered it. I know that. There's no punishment that ever comes. Why not keep going on, That's what these laws here are intended to deter. Continued criminal behavior. All right, any questions or comments? We need to stop. I shouldn't have asked for questions or comments. All right, guys. We'll pick up in Exodus 21 and verse 22 next week.